Sir, if we launch tomorrow, thousands of soldiers may never make it home. The words hung in the air like a storm cloud over the command center. Every conversation stopped. Every screen seemed suddenly less important. Dozens of officers turned toward the woman standing at the far end of the conference table. Major Claire Walker remained perfectly still, her hands resting on a classified briefing folder, her blue eyes fixed on the giant digital map glowing across the wall. The room inside Fort Liberty was one of the most secure military planning centers in the country. Rows of monitors displayed satellite imagery, logistics routes, weather forecasts, and troop movements stretching across hundreds of square miles. In less than 24 hours, Operation Iron Resolve would begin. It was one of the largest military deployments in recent years, involving thousands of service members, hundreds of vehicles, and months of preparation. At the center of it all stood General Daniel Brooks. At 58, Brooks was a decorated commander with a reputation for making bold decisions under pressure. His photograph hung in military academies. His leadership was studied in officer training courses. Few people ever challenged him publicly. Almost no one challenged him in front of an entire planning staff. Yet Claire Walker had just done exactly that. The silence stretched for several seconds. Some officers exchanged nervous glances. Others stared down at their notes, pretending not to notice the tension building around them. Claire understood what they were thinking. She had spent 15 years in military intelligence and strategic operations. She knew how rooms like this worked. Rank carried weight. Reputation carried even more. And right now, she was asking the most powerful person in the room to reconsider a mission that had already received final approval. General Brooks slowly folded his arms. His expression revealed nothing. "Major Walker," he said calmly, "are you suggesting that every analyst assigned to this operation missed something that only you managed to find?" A few officers shifted uncomfortably. Claire didn't react. She opened the folder and slid several satellite images across the table. "No, sir," she replied. "I'm suggesting the data changed faster than our assumptions." Brooks glanced at the images without reaching for them. "We've reviewed every possible scenario." "Respectfully, sir," Claire answered, "I don't believe we have." The temperature in the room seemed to drop. She could feel dozens of eyes watching her, waiting to see what would happen next. But Claire wasn't concerned about embarrassment. She wasn't worried about her career. What concerned her was the pattern she had spent the last 72 hours studying. A pattern hidden inside logistics reports, weather shifts, communication intercepts, and satellite movements. Individually, none of it seemed alarming. Together, it painted a picture she couldn't ignore. A picture that suggested the operation's primary route was far more vulnerable than anyone realized. General Brooks walked toward the digital map and stared at the highlighted deployment corridor. Thousands of soldiers would move through that route beginning tomorrow morning. Months of planning depended on it. Billions of dollars depended on it. National security depended on it. Changing course now would delay everything. Finally, Brooks turned back toward the room. "The operation proceeds as planned," he said. "We launch at 0600. No one spoke. Claire felt her stomach tighten, but her face remained calm. She had expected resistance. What she didn't know was that within the next 48 hours, every warning she had given would begin unfolding with terrifying precision. And when it did, the only plan capable of bringing thousands of soldiers safely home would be the one sitting untouched inside the folder in front of her. Most people inside Fort Liberty knew Major Claire Walker as the analyst who never raised her voice. She was not the loudest officer in the room. She was not the most decorated. Her name rarely appeared in headlines, and reporters never waited outside conference rooms hoping for a statement from her. Yet among the small circle of officers who had worked beside her in the field, Claire carried a different reputation. She was the person commanders called when something did not make sense. She had built her career finding patterns hidden inside chaos. 15 years earlier, she had graduated near the top of her class from the United States Military Academy. While many of her classmates dreamed of commanding troops on the front lines, Claire became fascinated by strategy. She spent countless hours studying historical campaigns, logistical failures, weather patterns, and communication networks. She believed that wars were often decided long before anyone stepped onto a battlefield. They were decided by information, timing, and decisions made inside rooms far from public view. Over the years, That belief earned her respect from some of the military's sharpest minds. During one overseas deployment, she identified a supply route problem that prevented an entire brigade from becoming stranded hundreds of miles from support. During another assignment, she detected inconsistencies in intelligence reports that ultimately saved months of planning from being wasted. None of those successes made her famous. Most remained buried inside classified reports. Claire preferred it that way. Recognition had never been her goal. Results were. Late that evening, long after the conference room had emptied, Claire sat alone inside a secure analysis center. The fluorescent lights reflected off rows of computer screens while most of the base prepared for the night. Outside, transport aircraft continued arriving and departing as Operation Iron Resolve moved closer to launch. Thousands of soldiers were already preparing equipment, reviewing assignments, and getting what little sleep they could before morning. Claire stared at a satellite image displayed across 3 monitors. Something continued bothering her. She zoomed in again. Then again. A series of small changes appeared along the deployment corridor. On their own, they seemed insignificant. A communications relay that had unexpectedly gone silent. Unusual vehicle movements detected over several days. Weather conditions shifting faster than projected. Small details. But Claire had learned long ago that major problems often announce themselves through small details first. A quiet knock interrupted her concentration. Captain Ethan Reynolds stepped inside, carrying 2 paper cups of coffee. Ethan had worked with Claire for nearly 4 years and was one of the few people who trusted her instincts without needing an explanation. He placed a cup beside her workstation. "You are still here?" he asked. Claire glanced at the clock. It was nearly 11:30. "I think I missed something," she said. Ethan pulled up a chair. "You have been saying that for 3 days." Claire folded her arms and looked back toward the screen. "That is exactly why I am worried." Ethan followed her gaze. "Do you really think the general is wrong?" Claire was quiet for a moment. "I think the operation is based on assumptions that were true last week." She paused. "I am not sure they are true anymore." Ethan studied her expression. After years of working together, he recognized the look immediately. Claire was not guessing. She was connecting dots nobody else had noticed yet. And that realization made him uneasy. Across the base, thousands of soldiers were preparing for tomorrow's launch. Most of them had never heard Claire Walker's name. None of them knew that one officer was still awake, searching through data deep into the night, trying to understand why a feeling she could not ignore kept telling her that something important was about to go terribly wrong. At 4:30 the next morning, Fort Liberty was already awake. Floodlights illuminated long rows of vehicles, while transport crews moved with practiced efficiency across the massive installation. The operation schedule remained unchanged. Aircraft were being fueled. Equipment was being loaded. Convoys were preparing for deployment. Everything was moving according to plan. Claire Walker stood beside a bank of monitors inside the operations center, watching reports flow across multiple screens. She had not gone home. She had not slept. During the previous 6 hours, she had reviewed every available source again, searching for something that would either confirm her concerns or prove she was mistaken. Instead, the pattern had only become clearer. Shortly after sunrise, she made a decision. If she was wrong, she would accept the consequences. If she stayed silent and the data was right, she would never forgive herself. Carrying a fresh briefing packet, Claire headed toward the command wing. The hallways were crowded with officers moving between final meetings. Most barely noticed her. Others offered quick greetings before continuing on. Inside the headquarters building, the atmosphere felt different from the analysis center. Confidence filled the corridors. Senior leaders believed they had spent months preparing for every possibility. To them, Operation Iron Resolve was ready. Claire arrived outside General Brooks's office just before 7 o'clock. His executive assistant looked surprised to see her. "Major Walker?" Claire nodded. "I need 5 minutes with the general." The assistant hesitated before disappearing through a side door. A minute later she returned. "You can go in." Brooks stood near a wall-sized map reviewing deployment schedules with 2 senior colonels. When Claire entered, all 3 looked up. The general's expression immediately hardened. "Major." Claire stepped forward and placed the briefing packet on the conference table. "Sir, I have additional information." One of the colonels exchanged an annoyed glance with the other. Brooks remained silent. Claire opened the packet and displayed several updated images. During the night, additional satellite passes confirmed unusual movement patterns near the primary corridor. Communication activity has increased significantly over the last 12 hours. Weather conditions have also shifted beyond our original models. Brooks looked at the documents for only a few seconds. And, sir, I recommend delaying deployment by 24 hours while we reassess the route. The room became quiet. One colonel actually sighed. Another checked his watch as if the conversation were wasting valuable time. Brooks slowly closed the folder. Major Walker, we discussed this yesterday. Yes, sir. And I already made my decision. Claire kept her voice calm. Sir, the situation has changed. Brooks walked around the table. No, the data changed. There is a difference. Claire knew she was losing the room. Still, she continued. Sir, every indicator points toward increased risk. I believe we should at least review alternate deployment options. Brooks stopped directly across from her. Do you understand what postponing this operation would mean? Yes, sir. It would affect thousands of personnel, multiple allied commands, and months of planning. I understand, sir. Brooks folded his arms. Then trust the process, Major. For a moment, neither spoke. Finally, Claire nodded once. Understood, sir. She gathered her papers and turned toward the door. As she reached it, Brooks spoke again. Your dedication is appreciated, Major. But sometimes leadership requires accepting uncertainty. Claire paused. Respectfully, sir, uncertainty is exactly what concerns me. Then she left. Back inside the operations center, Captain Ethan Reynolds immediately recognized the expression on her face. He said no again? Claire placed the folder on her desk and stared at the deployment map glowing across the wall. Thousands of soldiers were now only hours away from movement. Yes, she answered quietly. Ethan looked at the screens. So what now? Claire took a slow breath. Now we watch. Neither of them realized that before another day had passed, the operation would begin unfolding in ways that would force everyone inside Fort Liberty to remember the warnings they had chosen to ignore. By mid-morning, Operation Iron Resolve was fully underway. Across multiple regions, carefully coordinated movements unfolded according to schedule. Inside Fort Liberty, large screens displayed a constant stream of updates. Green status indicators filled the command center. Logistics teams reported successful progress. Communication networks remained active. Every report seemed to confirm that the operation was proceeding exactly as planned. General Daniel Brooks stood near the central display with a group of senior officers. The atmosphere was noticeably lighter than it had been the day before. Months of preparation appeared to be paying off. Several commanders were already discussing future phases of the mission. Confidence spread throughout the room. For many of them, the difficult part was over. Major Claire Walker did not share that confidence. From her workstation several rows behind the senior command section, she quietly monitored incoming data. Captain Ethan Reynolds sat nearby reviewing updates from various units. For most of the morning, nothing unusual appeared. That was what bothered Claire the most. The pattern she had been tracking suggested problems would not appear immediately. They would emerge gradually, hidden beneath the appearance of normal operations. Shortly after noon, a small notification appeared on one of her secondary monitors. It was easy to miss. In fact, most analysts probably would have ignored it. A routine communication relay station had unexpectedly stopped transmitting status updates. Claire immediately opened the report. Ethan noticed the change in her expression. What is it? He asked. Claire studied the screen. Relay Station 7 just went offline. Ethan frowned. Equipment issue? Maybe. She did not sound convinced. Within minutes, maintenance teams reported they were investigating. The explanation seemed reasonable. Electronic systems failed all the time. Nobody in command appeared concerned. Yet Claire added the report to a growing file she had been building since the operation began. An hour later, another anomaly appeared. This time it involved weather tracking. Conditions along part of the deployment corridor were changing faster than forecast models predicted. Again, the issue seemed minor. Again, nobody reacted. The operation continued. Claire quietly added another note to her file. By mid-afternoon, a third irregularity surfaced. Several routine communication updates arrived later than expected. The delay lasted only minutes before normal transmissions resumed. Most analysts considered the matter resolved. Claire did not. She leaned back in her chair, and stared at the collection of reports spread across multiple screens. Individually, each issue seemed harmless. Together, they formed the exact pattern she had feared. Ethan watched her for a moment. "You are seeing it again, are you not?" Claire nodded slowly. "The same progression. Could still be coincidence." "Yes," she said quietly. "It could." But even as she spoke, she sounded unconvinced. Across the command center, General Brooks continued receiving positive updates. Unit leaders reported successful movements. Supply chains remained on schedule. Morale was high. To everyone watching the official briefings, the operation looked like a complete success. Then, just before 5 o'clock, one of the largest displays in the room flashed yellow. Conversation stopped. Analysts turned toward their monitors. A forward coordination unit had missed a scheduled check-in window. Only by a few minutes. Nothing serious. Yet the room immediately became more alert. Brooks stepped closer to the display. "Status." An operations officer quickly responded. "We are attempting contact now, sir." Claire felt a knot form in her stomach. She had seen this sequence before in training simulations and historical case studies. Small anomalies, delayed responses, communication inconsistencies. None of them alarming by themselves. All of them dangerous when connected. Several tense minutes passed before contact was re-established. The room relaxed again. Officers returned to their conversations. Some even laughed nervously about the false alarm. Claire did not. She looked down at her notes and slowly closed the folder. Ethan noticed. "What are you thinking?" Claire kept her eyes on the deployment map glowing across the wall. Hundreds of icons continued moving steadily along their assigned routes. Everything still looked normal. "I think," she said softly, "we are running out of time." The command center felt different that evening. The confidence that had filled the room only hours earlier was beginning to fade. More screens were being watched. More questions were being asked. Conversations had become quieter. Major Claire Walker sat at her workstation studying a stream of incoming reports when a sharp, alert tone echoed across the operations floor. Several analysts immediately turned toward their monitors. A logistics coordinator stood up from his desk. "We have lost position updates from multiple units along the northern corridor," he announced. The room froze. General Daniel Brooks looked up from a briefing table across the floor. "For how long?" "Approximately 12 minutes, sir." 12 minutes was not catastrophic. Systems occasionally experienced delays. But when combined with everything that had happened throughout the day, the report felt different. Claire immediately opened the tracking data. Her eyes moved rapidly across the screen. Ethan Reynolds stepped beside her. "Tell me that is not what you think it is." Claire did not answer right away. Several additional alerts appeared. Communication traffic had become inconsistent. Weather interference was increasing. Several monitoring systems were reporting conflicting information. None of it made sense together. Unless the assumptions behind the operation were wrong. Across the room, officers began requesting updates from multiple departments. The calm rhythm of the command center disappeared. Brooks moved toward the central display as fresh information arrived. One sector showed delayed progress. Another showed incomplete reporting. A third displayed position estimates instead of confirmed locations. The operation was still moving forward, but visibility was deteriorating. "Give me a complete status review," Brooks ordered. Analysts immediately went to work. Claire watched the display wall as hundreds of data points updated in real time. The picture becoming visible was exactly the one she had feared. Not a sudden disaster. Something far worse for commanders. Uncertainty. Nobody knew exactly what was happening. Nobody knew how large the problem was. Every new report seemed to answer one question while creating 3 more. An hour later, the room had become noticeably tense. Senior officers stood in clusters reviewing maps and reports. Some units remained fully operational. Others were reporting delays. Several communication relays continued experiencing interruptions. The operation had not failed, but it was no longer unfolding according to plan. Then a transportation coordinator rushed toward the command section carrying a tablet. Brooks reviewed the information. His expression changed immediately. "When did this arrive?" he asked. 7 minutes ago, sir." Brooks looked back toward the display wall. Claire could see the realization forming. The pattern was no longer hidden inside isolated reports. It was visible. The deployment corridor was becoming increasingly unreliable. The assumptions supporting the original route were breaking apart piece by piece. Ethan looked toward Claire. "This is your model," he said quietly. Claire nodded. Every indicator she had identified was appearing in the same sequence she had predicted. Brooks slowly turned toward the operations floor. His eyes stopped on Claire. For several seconds, neither spoke. The room continued moving around them as reports arrived and officers exchanged updates. Finally, the general walked across the floor. The same officer who had dismissed her concerns twice now stood directly beside her workstation. "Major Walker," he said. His voice was calm, but different than before. "I need to know exactly what you think happens next." For the first time since the operation began, nobody interrupted her. Nobody questioned her. Every officer within hearing distance waited for her answer. The operations floor became silent. Dozens of officers watched Major Claire Walker as if they were seeing her for the first time. Only hours earlier, many of them had viewed her concerns as overly cautious. Now the same warning signs she had identified were appearing across the entire operation. Claire stood from her workstation and walked toward the central display. Her movements were calm, deliberate, almost routine. The room around her was tense, but she refused to let that tension affect her judgment. General Brooks followed her to the massive digital map that covered the wall. Hundreds of unit markers remained active, but gaps were beginning to appear throughout the primary deployment corridor. Claire tapped several locations on the display. New layers of information appeared. Communication interruptions, weather deviations, transportation bottlenecks, delayed status confirmations. Viewed separately, they looked manageable. Viewed together, they formed a dangerous chain reaction. "The original route depends on perfect coordination," Claire explained. "Every delay creates pressure on the next phase. Every disruption reduces visibility. The longer we continue forcing movement through the corridor, the less control we have over the operation." Brooks studied the map carefully. "How much time do we have?" Claire hesitated. "Less than we did yesterday." Nobody laughed. Nobody questioned her. Several senior officers exchanged concerned looks. One colonel stepped forward. "Are you saying we should stop the operation?" Claire shook her head. "No. Stopping now would create a different set of problems." She opened a separate file on the display. A new map appeared. The room immediately noticed the difference. Alternative routes stretched across multiple sectors. Additional logistics hubs appeared. Reserve communication networks were highlighted in blue. "What is that?" Brooks asked. Claire looked toward him. "The contingency plan I submitted 2 days ago." The room grew even quieter. Brooks remembered the folder. The same proposal he had reviewed only briefly before rejecting. Claire continued. "I built this plan assuming the primary corridor would become unreliable. It redistributes movement across multiple routes, expands communication coverage, and creates independent supply chains." Several officers moved closer to the display. One logistics commander began reviewing the routes. Another studied transportation estimates. The more they examined the plan, the more their expressions changed. Ethan Reynolds watched from the back of the room. He already knew what they were discovering. Claire had not spent the last 3 days simply identifying problems. She had spent them building solutions. "How long have you had this prepared?" one officer asked. 72 hours, Claire replied. The officer stared at her in disbelief. Brooks folded his arms. "And you believe this will stabilize the operation?" Claire met his eyes. "I believe it gives us our best chance to maintain control." For several seconds, the general said nothing. The weight of command rested heavily on his shoulders. Thousands of soldiers depended on decisions made inside this room. Every choice carried consequences. Finally, Brooks turned toward the senior staff. "Evaluate the plan immediately." Officers moved into action. Analysts rushed to review projections. Logistics teams began running calculations. Communication specialists examined network requirements. The command center transformed into controlled urgency. Claire remained beside the display, answering questions as quickly as they came. Route capacities, fuel requirements, transit timing, reserve support locations. Every answer was ready. Every detail had already been considered. Nearly an hour later, the reviews began returning. One by one, departments reached the same conclusion. The contingency plan was viable. More importantly, it addressed nearly every issue now emerging across the operation. General Brooks listened carefully to each assessment. When the final report arrived, he slowly looked toward Claire. The room waited. Then he gave the order nobody expected to hear. Implement Major Walker's contingency plan immediately. For the first time since the operation began, Claire allowed herself a small breath of relief. The difficult part was not over. In many ways, it was only beginning. But at least now they were no longer reacting blindly. They finally had a path forward. And that path had been sitting inside her folder all along. The next several hours became a race against time. Throughout Fort Liberty, teams worked around the clock to execute Major Claire Walker's contingency plan. The massive displays covering the operations center changed almost minute by minute as routes were adjusted, communication networks were expanded, and logistics schedules were rewritten. What had started as a carefully structured operation was now being reshaped in real time. Yet despite the pressure, something remarkable began to happen. The confusion that had been spreading across the deployment corridor started to stabilize. Claire stood at the center of a cluster of analysts, transportation officers, and communication specialists. Questions came from every direction. She answered each one without hesitation. Months of preparation and years of experience were now being compressed into a handful of critical hours. Captain Ethan Reynolds watched as officers who had barely acknowledged Claire earlier in the week now waited patiently for her recommendations. Every adjustment flowed through her plan. Every decision seemed connected to calculations she had already made long before the problems became visible. Route Bravo is now fully operational, one logistics officer reported. Additional supply assets have reached the secondary corridor. Another analyst looked up from his workstation. Communication coverage has increased by 30% since implementation. More updates followed. Transportation delays began shrinking. Missing status reports were reduced. Units that had struggled to maintain visibility were suddenly appearing clearly on command screens again. None of it happened instantly. None of it was easy. But for the first time since the operation began, the command center felt as though it was regaining control. General Brooks remained near the central display, listening carefully as reports arrived. The confidence he had shown at the beginning of the operation was gone. In its place was something different. Focus. Reflection. Several times his eyes drifted toward Claire as she coordinated solutions with calm precision. He was beginning to understand what the rest of the room had already realized. The plan working before them was not improvised. It was the result of preparation that nobody had taken seriously when it mattered most. Late that evening, another wave of reports arrived. This time the news was overwhelmingly positive. Multiple units had successfully transitioned onto alternate routes. Supply movement had normalized. Communication reliability continued improving. Even the weather-related disruptions that had complicated earlier phases were becoming manageable because the operation was no longer dependent on a single corridor. Ethan approached Claire holding a fresh set of updates. "You should see this." Claire reviewed the report. A small smile appeared for the first time in days. "That is better than I expected." "A lot better," Ethan replied. Around them, officers exchanged relieved looks. Some quietly celebrated improvements that only hours earlier had seemed impossible. The operation was not perfect. Challenges still existed. But the downward spiral everyone feared had been interrupted. The situation was moving in the right direction. Shortly before midnight, a senior operations officer walked directly to General Brooks. He handed over a summary report containing updated projections. Brooks read every page carefully. The room waited. Finally, he looked up. "Current estimates?" The officer answered without hesitation. "The revised plan has preserved operational continuity across nearly all sectors, sir." Brooks nodded slowly. Then came the number that captured everyone's attention. Thousands of personnel who would have been affected by the growing failures along the original corridor had successfully transitioned through the new network created by Claire's plan. The room fell silent. For several seconds, nobody spoke. Everyone understood what that meant. The operation had not been saved by luck. It had been saved because one officer refused to stop asking difficult questions when nobody wanted to hear the answers. Morning arrived over Fort Liberty with a sense of relief that few people had expected 24 hours earlier. The operations center was still busy, but the frantic urgency of the previous night had faded. Analysts continued monitoring reports. Logistics teams reviewed updated schedules. Communication specialists tracked network performance. For the first time since the operation began, the flow of information felt stable. Major Claire Walker sat quietly at her workstation reviewing the latest summaries. She looked exhausted. She had slept only a few hours in the past several days. Empty coffee cups sat beside stacks of reports that had become worn from constant use. Yet despite the fatigue, her attention remained fixed on the screens in front of her. Captain Ethan Reynolds approached, carrying a fresh situation report. "You should probably read this one," he said. Claire accepted the document and scanned the first page. Her eyes moved quickly through the numbers. Then she turned to the next page. And the next. By the time she finished, she leaned back slowly in her chair. The figures were remarkable. Thousands of personnel had successfully completed movements through the revised network established by her contingency plan. Supply operations had stabilized. Communication reliability had improved dramatically. Transportation delays continued shrinking. Even several senior commands operating hundreds of miles apart had reported that the new structure provided greater flexibility than the original design. Ethan smiled. "Looks different than it did yesterday." Claire nodded. "A lot different." Across the room, officers who had spent the previous evening preparing for worsening conditions were now discussing future objectives. Confidence was returning. More importantly, it was returning because the operation had adapted successfully rather than simply hoping conditions would improve. General Daniel Brooks spent most of the morning reviewing after-action assessments. Report after report reached the same conclusion. The contingency measures introduced by Claire had prevented escalating disruptions from spreading throughout the operation. Several analysts estimated that without the revised structure, coordination problems would have multiplied as the mission expanded. Others noted that the alternate routes and independent support networks had provided resilience that planners had not fully appreciated before implementation. The deeper commanders examined the data, the clearer the picture became. Claire's warnings had not been theoretical. They had been accurate. Shortly before noon, a senior briefing was held inside the main conference room. Nearly every key officer involved in the operation attended. Large screens displayed performance metrics from the previous 24 hours. General Brooks stood at the front reviewing the results. The atmosphere felt very different from the meeting where Claire's concerns had first been dismissed. This time, nobody questioned the numbers. Nobody argued with the outcomes. The evidence spoke for itself. As the briefing continued, several commanders openly acknowledged the effectiveness of the revised plan. Logistics officers praised the distributed network structure. Communications leaders highlighted increased reliability. Transportation specialists pointed to reduced congestion and improved operational flexibility. Claire sat quietly near the back of the room, taking notes as she always did. She never interrupted. She never sought attention. In fact, she seemed almost uncomfortable whenever praise moved in her direction. Yet each report reinforced the same reality. The operation's recovery was directly tied to decisions she had prepared long before anyone realized they would be needed. By the end of the meeting, there was little doubt remaining. Thousands of soldiers had completed critical phases of the mission safely and efficiently because one officer had continued analyzing problems that others believed were already solved. The room slowly emptied after the briefing concluded, but a feeling lingered among those who had been present. It was the realization that competence often speaks quietly, and sometimes the person nobody listens to at the beginning becomes the person everyone depends on when it matters most. 2 days later, the operations center at Fort Liberty had returned to its normal rhythm. The emergency adjustments were complete. The revised network continued performing effectively. Reports from across the operation showed stability, efficiency, and coordination that few people would have believed possible during the tense hours when uncertainty threatened to overwhelm the mission. Major Claire Walker sat quietly at her desk reviewing final assessment documents. To anyone passing by, it looked like an ordinary morning. She was doing exactly what she always did: analyzing information, verifying details, preparing for whatever challenge might come next. The door to the operations floor opened, and conversations gradually faded. General Daniel Brooks entered accompanied by several senior officers. Nobody had been informed of a scheduled briefing. Curious looks spread throughout the room. Claire remained focused on her reports until Captain Ethan Reynolds gently nudged her shoulder. "Claire," he whispered, "you might want to look up." She glanced toward the front of the room and immediately realized something unusual was happening. Brooks stopped near the central display and surveyed the gathered personnel. "Attention," he said. The room became completely silent. Officers, analysts, specialists, and support staff turned toward him. For a moment, Brooks simply stood there, as if carefully choosing his words. Then he looked directly at Claire Walker. "Major Walker, please join me." Confused murmurs spread across the room. Claire stood and walked forward. Every eye followed her. When she reached the front, Brooks faced the assembled staff. "Leadership is often associated with rank," he began. "But sometimes leadership appears long before authority recognizes it." The room remained silent. Brooks continued. "Several days ago, this operation faced challenges that threatened its success. Many people worked tirelessly to overcome those challenges." He paused. "But one officer identified the risks before anyone else. One officer built solutions before anyone asked for them. One officer continued speaking up even after being told she was wrong." Claire looked down slightly, clearly uncomfortable with the attention. Brooks turned toward her. "Major Walker, your professionalism, preparation, and dedication directly contributed to the success of this operation and the well-being of thousands of soldiers depending on it." The words carried enormous weight coming from a commander with his reputation. Then something happened that nobody expected. General Brooks stepped back, straightened his posture, and raised his hand in a formal salute. The room froze. For several seconds, nobody moved. Claire's eyes widened slightly in surprise. Brooks held the salute, not because protocol required it, not because of rank, because respect demanded it. Claire returned the salute. Around the room, officers exchanged stunned looks. Some were witnessing one of the most powerful moments of their careers. Brooks lowered his hand and spoke quietly enough that the room had to listen carefully. "I should have listened sooner." Claire met his gaze. "Sir, what matters is that we adapted." Brooks nodded. "That is exactly why you are the officer you are." As the room erupted into applause, Claire felt something she had not expected. It was not pride. It was not victory. It was relief. The mission had succeeded. The people depending on it had been supported. The plan had worked. And the lesson everyone carried away from that room had nothing to do with titles or authority. It was a reminder that wisdom can come from unexpected places, that preparation matters more than ego, and that true respect is never demanded. It is earned through competence, integrity, and the courage to speak when everyone else chooses silence.